Why does he have this obsession with tariffs as a policy tool? Obviously, he's playing to, a political audience at home. But the problem with China's, trillion-dollar trade surplus last year is that exports are booming. They're growing by about 10 or 12%, 3 times as fast as world trade. How bad do things have to get before Xi Jinping's personal position is at risk?
China is tooling up for a trade war. Trump's tariffs will hit China's crucial export market, forcing the country to look for other solutions to ease the pain. George Magnus from Oxford University's China Centre joins me now. Welcome, George. We saw Xi meeting the tech tycoons, including Liang Wenfeng, who is the hero of the hour since he introduced his open source AI platform DeepSeek. What do you think the plan is here?
It's kind of interesting, actually, to look at the symposium that was held. This is the third time that Xi Jinping has held such a symposium with entrepreneurs and private businesses. The first one was in 2018, as Donald Trump had started his first trade war. The second one was in 2020, when China was in sort of full flow of clamping down on Jack Ma and Alibaba and the whole kind of suppression of the tech sector and the digital sector in China. And so this is the third time and follows a number of kind of initiatives that the government's taken to be softer and have a much kind of gentler rhetoric with private firms and entrepreneurs. And Xi Jinping obviously wants to have them on board in the face of what is, difficult time for the Chinese economy anyway, but also exacerbated, as you say, by the prospect of trade disruption, export controls, and who knows what's coming down the track. But certainly the 10% down payment of tariffs imposed by the United States on Chinese products, incremental tariff, probably is just the beginning of more to come.
It must be strange to be a tycoon of any description in China these days. We had Jack Ma disappear. The tall poppy syndrome that if you do too well, you're going to get your head will be cut off. Do you think the private sector is still wary?
Well, if you read the sort of comments that were made by some of China's entrepreneurial titans after the symposium, obviously they're all very happy and on board and happy to support the government and go forth and multiply, in terms of strategic industries and increased competitiveness, et cetera, et cetera. I suspect, though, that privately things are not quite as kind of rosy as it's painted out to be. It is a moot point, I think it's fair to say, whether the kind of disaffection that I think is paramount in the kind of private sector in China, whether that's due only to the kind of repressive attitude of the government. And remember that Xi Jinping said in his formal speech to them that government policies are not going to change and that the government's overall economic strategy is what it is. It's, you have to accept it, take it or leave it, mostly take it. But I think that it's a moot point whether it's that or whether actually it's the state of demand in the Chinese economy. Let me put it this way. If Chinese companies were making money hand over fist, and I don't mean state enterprises, which tend not to make that much money, but private firms in particular, if they were making money hand over fist and they were looking at buoyant consumer demand and healthy growth of the way that they probably were looking at business maybe 10 or 20 years ago, would they be in need of this kind of pep talk? I don't think so. So it's a combination, I think, both of the fact that the economy is not in great shape and the government is not really doing anything about it, or not much, or not much that's effective. But also, obviously, the political atmosphere, I think, is something which is not going to change. The government can't really change that.
Now we're hearing a lot less talk these days about the real estate crisis and local government debt. Why do you think that is? I mean, have these issues been resolved, or are they better than they were, or is this just the way the narrative is being imposed now?
Yeah, I think it's not, they've definitely not been resolved, but there may be a bit of a hiatus going on now. I mean, remember that last year, for an economy that was allegedly growing by about 5% in 2024, it's probably going to have a target about the same level this year. For that sort of economy, the government was boosting liquidity all during the year. It cut interest rates a few times. It lowered banks' reserve requirements at least twice. There was huge efforts made to stabilize the housing sector and increase the attractiveness of sales for hard-pressed homeowners or would-be homeowners. What else did we have? We had 10 trillion yuan, so that's like over over $1.25 trillion of debt swaps announced by the central government for local governments to alleviate the debt pressures and the financing pressures they're under. The government really pushed out the boat last year to try to sort of rescue what was, I think, an economy that was probably not growing anywhere close to 5%. I think there's the spirit with which I think private entrepreneurs are kind of coming into 2025. I mean, it may look okay, but actually the real estate market is sales are picking up a little bit in tier one cities. Prices have sort of just put the head above the parapet, as it were. I think we've got like 0.1% increase in home prices year over year in tier one cities, 5 tier one cities. So there's a bit of a kind of a lull, I would say, going on, and the economy should actually do a little bit better in 2025 than what was a much worse performance than seen in 2024. But these problems have not really been resolved, and they're not going away quickly.
So looking at this year, I mean, we're seeing the Chinese, there's basically two problems in many ways. The Chinese consumers are not spending money, and then you have these overcapacity problems overseas. Looking at the domestic economy, Chinese consumers are not spending the money. What do you think it would take to get them to start flashing the cash again?
Well, I think, the answer to that question is pretty simple, really, which is, in order to bolster household consumption, which I'm sure a lot of people know this, but actually by way of reminders is, private consumption in China, if you exclude social security benefits and, the role of the government in terms of the consumer sector. But private consumption is probably no more than about 39 or 40% of GDP, which in terms of most of China's peer group and not to mention developed economies is much closer to 60 to 70%. So it's very low. To basically get consumers to kind of fork out more, they have to have a much greater capacity to be able to spend money, which means income. So if you want to boost household consumption in China, you have to boost income growth. If you want to boost income growth, it's a distributional problem. You have to take it away from local governments and the state sector and state enterprises and redistribute to private firms, private households. That's politically very awkward for the government to do because it entails a redistribution, not just of economic capacity, but a redistribution of political power. As you can imagine, the Chinese Communist Party is not really very keen on doing that.
Right. And given that we have these struggles of the domestic economy, at the same time, you've got the threat of tariffs, you've got massive overcapacity. I mean, a lot of these Chinese companies, for example, have been selling goods overseas at massive discounts ahead of possible tariffs, which means that they could be very exposed. It's quite a balancing act at this stage, really, for the Chinese government to manage these two challenges. Is that right?
It is. As things stand, I don't think that the additional 10% tariffs on Chinese products I don't think they're going to be that crippling or actually that influential in terms of the Chinese economy this year, because there are ways in which obviously the Chinese economy and the Chinese government can bypass the effect. So they could allow the exchange rate to depreciate, for example, much as they did in 2017 and 2018. And that would help to kind of defray the impact on China to some degree. And also, as we saw during the years following the initial tariffs from the Trump administration in 2017-18, Chinese companies and foreign companies in China can actually relocate their production or their trade, essentially, to third countries, for example, like Vietnam or India or Thailand. Mexico, although that's not kind of safe anymore either, but to other countries in order to bypass the origin, the impact of the tariff on the mainland. So 10%, I think, is probably dealable with, if you'll pardon the expression. But if Trump came back, for example, and imposed 25% tariffs, I mean, he's talking about so-called reciprocal tariffs, and there's a lot that China and particularly other emerging and developing countries do have recourse to. All sorts of things that the Americans could invoke, not just in terms of direct tariffs, but also non-tariff measures, or so-called behind-the-border measures, which are part of a kind of industrial policy, which China does on a very, very massive scale. So these tariffs could actually take a much bigger toll on China. I mean, on everybody really, including the United States. But it would be if they were to like 25% or 35% tariffs on top of what's already been imposed. Then I think then we would probably be talking about a much more deleterious effect on the Chinese economy.
Right. You mentioned the Trump administration there, and one thing I think we've learned from the last few weeks is that nobody really knows what Donald Trump is going to do. But Chinese policy has tended to be to kind of drive a wedge between Europe and the US. And, and obviously I'm not going to ask you the question about what will Donald do, but the US doesn't seem to be exactly helping its allies by taking what's quite a highly antagonistic approach, really, to European values. For example, at the weekend, we saw at the Munich Security Conference there. Do you think that Donald Trump is prepared to fight China on his own, or do you think he will try to enlist European help? I mean, is it possible to read anything from what we know already, without having to try and predict anything, but from what we know already, do you think that, what do we know about what approach Donald Trump is going to take on tariffs and, say, on European involvement in that fight?
Okay, I probably ought to look over my shoulder as I speak, just in case it's being overtaken by events, given the breakneck speed with which things have been happening. But I mean, it does stick in the throat a bit, actually quite a lot, that the obsession which the American government and certainly the president has with tariffs as a concept and as a tool is being applied, perhaps at least so far, more specifically against neighbors and allies than it is against adversaries. And I think that's a really awkward concept for us to get hold of. Yes, okay, we know that, as far as Canada and Mexico are concerned, the sort of the across the board 25% tariffs have been basically suspended. But in the meantime, we've had the announcement of tariffs on steel and aluminium, and also the investigation into reciprocal tariffs, which there'll be a decision about probably by the end of March, beginning of April. So in the end, I think, that America's allies are going to be kind of hit with tariffs. I mean, that's just kind of, why would they do that? Well, why does he have this obsession with tariffs as a policy tool? Obviously, he's playing to, a political audience at home. I mean, the economics of using tariffs is, there's quite a huge literature about how ineffective and inefficient they are. But for political reasons, it must be something that the United States, or the government actually feels, is doing it a favor. I mean, I can't really see where the upside in all of that is, and I, hope that there will be sufficient carve-outs and caveats that, people will come to their senses before long. But for the moment, I think it's a very, very difficult situation. Having said that, of course, from a European point of view, I mean, I think people have to be in our neck of the woods, in this part of the world, we have to be really careful, because obviously we don't want, in opposing the United States, which our right to do on these matters, we don't want to basically open our industries and our communities to unfair competition from the People's Republic of China at the same time, which wouldn't make any sense either. So we are definitely stuck between a rock and a hard place here, and have to be quite careful how we calibrate our policy responses.
In your book, Red Flags, you state how Xi's policies are ultimately incompatible with China's economic aspirations. I mean, it's one of the many points in the book, but a key one. Do you think the argument that slowing economic growth could lead to domestic instability still works in, say, an era of mass surveillance, enhanced state control? Or do you think that it's moved on? And do you think also that recent developments have in some ways kind of highlighted the difficulties that Xi's government is facing?
Yeah, I think domestic instability or domestic political instability, can obviously take maybe not a huge number of forms, but certainly at least two major kind of variants. One is, people come out into the streets and object and put the government under pressure or turn them out. Obviously, nobody's really expecting that to happen in China. But the other is there could be, it could stir and spur instability within the party, and certainly amongst the sort of upper echelons of the party, if things go awry. Now, that begs the question is, how bad do things have to get before Xi Jinping's personal position is at risk? Clearly not now, and he seems certainly to be very firmly in control. But I just think that might be a kind of a watch this space, because in the coming years, and I say years rather than kind of weeks or months, if China's economy is kind of basically decelerating to the point where it is only going to grow at a very kind of pedestrian pace on average, which means that from time to time it may do much worse than average, as well as other times better than average. But if things become much more circumspect in terms of the economy's capacity to grow, and at the same time, China is kind of rubbing other countries up the wrong way, because it's not just the United States and Europe and Japan and Australia, for example, that have issues with Chinese industrial policy and the effect this is having on export promotion. Nobody minds China's exports going up if their imports are going up at the same time. But the problem with China's, $1 trillion trade surplus last year is that exports are booming. They're growing by about 10 or 12%, 3 times as fast as world trade. But imports are stagnant or falling. So that's basically about China's economic model, which is just a long-winded way for me to say that it's not just the kind of developed market villains, that are turning up to object to Chinese trade practices, but India, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, Philippines, lots of places are expressing concerns now about Chinese dumping, Chinese products being shipped in huge quantities at low prices, which basically impair the resilience and competitive ability of the countries that are, also in the global south as well as in the global north, so to speak. So I think these are issues which will weigh on China in the years to come. And certainly in the foreseeable future, I think that's quite likely. So I think these things, could cause all sorts of kind of unpredictable, unforecastable issues, really. Like it could be, it could elicit some sort of greater outbreak of nationalism in China. It could spur, foreign policy actions which are perhaps wouldn't have happened otherwise as a distraction. So I think that it's very difficult to be confident, I think, that the stability which the Communist Party craves, as a matter of fact, that stability can be guaranteed, both domestically and abroad.
So a lot of challenges facing Xi Jinping and the Communist Party right now. George Magnus, thanks very much for bringing all those together and putting them into context.
Thank you.